Hello, and welcome to Lecture 2 on Globalization 2, Chapter 2, Some Basic Issues, Debates, and Controversies. So basically what this lecture is going to be about is the main debates and conflicts within the field of global studies when analyzing the process or processes of globalization. So, just the field of globalization studies is riddled with differences of opinion and great debates. So, the first one is really basic. Is there such a thing as globalization? And the two main positions would be the globalist position that does affirm that there is a phenomenon or collection of processes that can be referred to as globalization, and that's a worthwhile distinction that's comprehensible and a way to approach the study of what it means to live in modern society. Whereas the other side would be the skeptics that are skeptical of the term globalization and the concept globalization. So, where are the skeptics coming from? They contend that vast portions of the globe and a significant portion of the world's population are wholly or in significant part outside of and even actively excluded from the processes generally associated with globalization. That the people that are excluded are substantial enough and are excluded in a significant enough way that thinking of globalization as one single phenomenon or even a collection of processes is really sort of incomprehensible. That the problem is globalization doesn't exist because the concept is an oversimplification of a bunch of contradictory processes. So some skeptics are open to globalizations or the ways that different processes affect different parts of the world in a way that would acknowledge sort of the uneven impact of what globalists would refer to as globalization. So it's not that the skeptics don't believe in processes like westernization, stuff like that, but that these processes associated with globalization are so uneven and contradictory that it doesn't really make sense to refer to them all under one umbrella concept like globalization. So, one aspect of the distinction between the globalist perspective and the skeptic perspective is how they conceptualize the importance of the nation state versus multinational corporations. So, the globalist perspective is that the nation state, whether powerful or weak, is still a key part of globalization. That globalization doesn't involve uniformly nation states gaining or losing power, that all of the fluctuations of their power are part of globalization, whether they restrict flow or whether they are conducive to flow. Also, I have here the globalists see all sorts of relationships possible in a global world, many of which do not involve governments, while the skeptics argue that the world continues to be dominated by relations among and between national governments. So the skeptics, one more nuanced difference between the globalist and skeptic perspective is that skeptics sort of really amplify the power and position of the nation state, and especially in the last 10 years, growing sense of nationalism all over the globe, rather than the power of transnational corporations. Where these two positions also differ is that the globalists still think of one global popular culture as having quite a lot of importance globally, whereas skeptics sort of think that this global popular culture is overemphasized and is not as strong or ever present or ubiquitous as a globalist would be tempted to say. So these are the two positions. So the textbook is taking a globalist perspective. The textbook, and they're pretty explicit about that that's the position that they're taking, that the concept of globalization is a helpful umbrella concept for a complex network of different processes that characterize the world that we're living in today, that makes sense. Another distinction is whether it'd be better to refer to these processes as globalization or transnationalism. So we have to make a distinction between globalization and transnationalism. So transnationalism refers to processes that interconnect individuals and social groups across specific predefined geopolitical borders, like the borders around a nation state, transnationalism. And transnationality refers to the rise of new communities and formation of new social identities and relations that cannot be defined through the traditional reference point of nation states. So globalization is basically a broader concept than transnationalism. Transnationalism is looking at transference and flow among different nation states with defined borders, whereas globalization can be a more fluid and larger concept. So the textbook illustrates this concept or this distinction between looking at baseball as a transnational phenomenon, where it is true that baseball is associated with the United States and is most popular in the United States, but there are other countries that are involved in baseball, and also other countries that provide players to play in the major leagues in the United States, like the Dominican Republic, for example, versus soccer, what we call soccer and the rest of the world calls football, as a more globalized sport, because it truly involves like all like the whole globe is sort of invested. It's a broader, more ever-present, more popular sport that's really ingrained in the global popular culture, with the exception of the United States. Like, we're becoming more interested in soccer, the global phenomenon of soccer, but it's still not as big of a deal here as it is in other parts of the world. So when did globalization begin? Nyan Chanda sees globalization as this really just almost part of human nature urge for a better life that relates to trade, missionary work, or wanting, if you have a particular religion or worldview or ideology, wanting to spread that ideology, the thirst for adventure, sort of a more maybe sinister drive for conquest, that sort of these processes like trade and missionary work and conquest are part of human nature and are really the forces that like undergird what we would call globalization and comes to fruition as globalization. Another perspective is that globalization is a long-term cyclical process, that there have been other global ages. So that would look at like the Roman Empire, for example, the Arab conquest as like another globalizing era, the spread of Buddhism throughout Asia, that there are comparable processes to the processes that we would refer to as globalization today, just maybe not at the scale and intensity that we're seeing today. Another way of thinking about it, instead of cyclical processes, would be phases. So that there are phases of globalization that can be traced all the way back to the agricultural and urban revolutions, when human beings started to go from nomadic hunter-gatherer societies and develop agriculture, which turned into cities, so therefore urban revolutions. And then the commercialization and trade between these cities, the Silk Route, Euro-Atlantic trade, the emergence of multinational corporations or MNCs in the 20th century, that all these major develops that sort of create a paradigm shift in human life on the globe can be seen as a helpful way of understanding the process of globalization, as something that comes about through phases. And this phase way of looking at it assumes interconnectivity increases over time, and that it's not cyclical, that there has been increasing in intensity and scale. Whereas thinking of it as a cyclical process would be kind of the perspective that downplays the uniqueness of globalized processes today in relation to more static, or what we called more solid eras that were prior to this. Robertson sees globalization as beginning in the early 15th century because he thinks that globalization is an integral part of the rise of capitalism and imperialism, and that globalization at its core has an economic base, and that economic base comes about with the rise of capitalism. So what is capitalism? Like, that's something we need to pause and try to define. So I think a helpful definition of capitalism is that industry that involves the private ownership of the means of production. So the means of production are privately owned. Factories or what have you are privately owned and are driven by profit. It's a for-profit economic system where the means of production are privately owned. I think regardless of how you feel about capitalism, that's a definition that's very neutral, that everyone would sort of agree with. And in some aspects of capitalism would involve trying to always find new markets to keep growing profit. You need new workers, so that many people point out that it's not really a coincidence that European imperialism and colonialism come about and are contingent with the rise of capitalism in Europe, because capital accumulation requires more and more resources, more and more territory, more and more workers, and more markets to expand into. So that's not a coincidence that the rise of capitalism and the age of imperialism correspond historically. And it's interesting. So Karl Marx is like sort of the first person to look at capitalism and analyze it as a system that isn't just natural, like a natural market, but like as a particular system. And he actually thought that, as much as he hated capitalism, thought it was a necessary stage of development, because prior to capitalism, you have all these hunter-gatherer tribes or what have you, and within those tribes or early human communities, you had like a state of pure communism. There probably wasn't private property, so on and so forth. But what the problem was that these tribes would have to go at war with each other over the scarcity of resources, that they didn't have enough control over nature and were at the mercy of nature. So they were battling other tribes for resources. What happens through feudalism and then capitalism is that in the thirst for creating greater profits, there is an urge to make production as efficient as possible, which is why Marx pointed out that it's not just imperialism and colonialism that go along with capitalism, but also a rapid growth in technological development, that it's not a coincidence that we see really expedited and stark technological development with the rise and development of capitalism, because there's an urge to create things more efficiently. So you see the rise of machines and so on and so forth. And then what happens is capitalism is good, according to Marx, or maybe not good, but necessary, according to Marx, because it leads to the technological development that enables humans to no longer be completely at the mercy of nature and to be able to have better control over resources. And capitalism is also necessary, according to Marx, because it coincides with imperialism and colonialism, which are horribly violent processes, but these processes are ultimately good because they create a global community. So there's no longer a tribe outside of the global tribe to be at war with. There's going to be one global community of communism, is basically what he thinks history is headed towards. And capitalism was a necessary stage because it created one global community, and it created enough technological development for humans to not be at the mercy of scarcity of resources because of nature. So that was a long-winded explanation, and we'll get back to talking about capitalism even later in this lecture. But you also have a whole field called world systems analysis, which is an approach to studying globalization. And it's really complicated, but it just tries to be as holistic as possible and points out how there's a core within the process of globalization. There are certain geopolitical territories, like the global north, that are the core of this process that benefit more from the processes of globalization, which would include capitalism, and then what they call the periphery, which would be third world, so-called third world countries, or the global south, that do not benefit hardly at all, if at all, from the globalized capitalist culture and economy. So some ways of thinking about globalization, just to recap this slide, would be as cyclical processes, as phases. And another way similar to phases would just be to look at really particular events as ways to analyze the development of globalization. So, for example, the rise of the Roman Empire, the rise and spread of Christianity and Islam, the travels of Vikings, activities of banks in the 12th century Italian city-states. That was sort of the beginning of finance and finance capital, which would end up being a really dominant force in the world today. The discovery or encounter of the New World, European colonialism, and then, of course, specific technological developments that made travel and communication easier. Some broader, more recent changes that many people point to as really integral to understanding the globalized world that we live in today would include major changes that occurred in the last half of the 20th century. Specifically, the three that you see mentioned a lot would be the emergence of the United States as the global superpower in the years following World War II, the emergence of multinational corporations. And I kind of jumped ahead in the last slide and talked about Marx's position on globalization, that he thinks it's a good thing, and he thinks that it comes about through a really bloody and violent process that involves capitalism, but it will enable a state of pure global communism in the future. And I'll get back to this other bullet in a second. And then the demise of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. So some stuff I didn't say about capitalism before. This is also some really basic Marxian analysis of capitalism. So it says there C equals C. And that's basically the setup of the earliest human economies. You'd have some sort of commodity like goat's milk and exchange it for another commodity of equal value, like a certain amount of barley, for example. And then in more sophisticated, economically sophisticated or complex societies, you have a commodity, goat's milk, that you exchange for a certain monetary value, like, a certain price, M, amount of money, and then exchange that money for a commodity of equal value. What Marx pointed out is under capitalism, you have this really unnatural basic mode of exchange where since it's profit driven, you start out with a certain amount of money and then you create a commodity. You use that money to create a commodity, and then you end up with more money, M prime, more money, like profit at the end of it. And he says, what is happening here? How do you end up with more money at the end of this simple mode of production and exchange? And he says the way that you accomplish that is by basically undercompensating labor. The people that make the commodity, that are working for an hourly wage in a factory, if they were compensated for the value that they actually create in making the commodity, the factory wouldn't have a profit. The profit is, to an extent, a quantitative measurement of how much the factory is undercompensating workers for the value that they create. And so that's why his argument was capitalism is an inherently exploitative economic system, that profit is exploitation at its bare bones level. So that's where he was coming from. And we'll talk about neoliberalism and the defense of capitalism and some Marxian responses to that later in this course too. So globalization or globalizations, like there are so many different features and aspects to what we're talking about. We're talking about economic globalization, we're talking about political globalization, cultural, and there are examples for us. Like the economic would probably be capitalism and neoliberalism. Political would be neoliberalism. We'll talk about that later. Maybe democratization. Cultural would be things like consumerism, for example, which also overlaps with economic globalization. Religion, the spread of the global religions, both Christianity and Islam, for example, but also the rise of, Buddhism and interest in Asian and Eastern thought within the West. Science, the sort of global conversation on science and development of technology that corresponds to that. Health and medicine, sports, education, that there are so many different arenas that we're talking about when we're talking about globalization. So again, like going back to like the globalist is sort of saying we can talk about all of these things simultaneously under the umbrella of globalization, where the skeptics that disagree with the globalists say, no, these are so distinct, but sometimes overlapping and complicated and interconnected and also contradictory arenas that it makes more sense to just say globalizations if we're going to be talking about these processes at all. Some other debates. So what drives globalization? Some people think it's more material. Other people think it's more ideological. So the people that think it's more material focus on objective factors and forces such as capitalism, multinational corporations, MNCs, versus the people that are saying it's ideological, focus on changes in thinking, ideas, and knowledge, such as understandings of climate change, for example. Other debates would be, does globalization hop rather than flow? And what they mean by that is to what extent is globalized development uneven and involving inequality and flowing more easily through what's called the developed world rather than the undeveloped world. And we'll talk about development at a later date. If there is such a thing as globalization, is it inexorable? Inexorable is a textbook word for unstoppable. Like, is it unstoppable? And a distinction would be globalization from above is thinking about globalization as a process created and controlled by centralized and powerful groups such as the billionaire class, for example. Whereas globalization from below involves marginalized groups and social movements which struggle to make globalization benefit more people and be more democratic. Sometimes globalization from below, according to the textbook, is misnamed when it's considered anti-globalization. That more accurately, it's alter or other globalization or a global justice movement. Does globophilia or globophobia have the upper hand? So people that take the globophilia, that means love of globalization and love of global phenomenon, point out that globalization seems to involve increasing democratization and the spread of civil society standing up to the state, whereas globophobia involves criticisms of capitalism, and we explain how exploitation does seem to go hand in hand with capitalism. There's conservatives that come from a globophobic perspective, such as Pat Buchanan, who thinks that instead of like a globalized culture, we need a conservative nationalism. And often on the right, when people are globophobic, they're concerned with immigration and keeping nation states more solidly defined and less permeable in order to preserve national identity. Trump's America First sort of mantra is a sort of right-leaning, global-phobic position. On the left, you have Noam Chomsky and other thinkers that are criticize neoliberal globalization. And we'll talk about neoliberalism. It's really confusing because it has the word liberal in it, but in the context of the United States, it's an ideology that's very conservative. That means that states should have very little power, the market should have a lot of power. As much privatization as you can have is good, so on and so forth. So Noam Chomsky thinks that what goes along with this ideology is that you have the haves versus the people, that this involves massive concentration of wealth at the top to the detriment of most of society. I think it's worth pointing out I discovered recently that we globally, even with the production of meat, which is a very resource wasting industry, but even with the amount of meat that we consume globally, we produce enough food for every single human being on the planet to consume 2,800 calories a day. However, there are about 800 million people struggling with being malnourished and hunger. So the issue isn't that we don't have enough food to feed everybody. The issue is because of the concentration of wealth at the top, you could argue, we don't have enough opportunities for people to prove they deserve the food. They don't have enough jobs, we don't have enough resources, ways for people to earn access to the food and to the resources. And that might be related to the concentration of wealth and power at the top. Noam Chomsky thinks that rather than thinking of capitalism and democracy as two sides of the same coin, that privatization is actually detrimental to democracy. Where a lot of people are coming from with this would be for example, in the United States, we have for-profit prisons. We have privately owned prisons that are owned by corporations in the private prison industry. And there is a paper trail of these corporations being involved in organizations like one called, that the abbreviation is ALEC, that write laws that politicians try to pass at the local level that lead to the imprisonment of more Americans, such as putting into place mandatory minimum sentences, where if you commit even a nonviolent drug crime, you have to serve 85% of your sentence, and there's a mandatory minimum of 30 years or something like that to keep the prisons full. So that would be a threat to our democracy because of private interest. That would be a concrete example. Noam Chomsky and a lot of the people on the left that are critical of globalization are also anti-imperialist, and we'll talk about imperialism at a later date. And just the global phobic perspective is just concerned about growing economic inequality throughout the whole planet. A sort of middle ground between globophilia and globophobia would be Jagdish Bhagwati's idea that there needs to be, globalization isn't good or bad, but it needs to be highly regulated. And another thinker, Kellner, argues that globalization is full of contradictions and includes both winners and losers, and that it's too complex and contradictory to just say on the whole that it's good or bad, that these are oversimplified positions. So what, I should say, if anything, that is anything, can be done about globalization? So the textbook says some people think nothing, that it's inexorable, it's unstoppable, that social processes have a life of their own, which is called reification, that the market has taken on a life of its own and it controls every aspect of our lives and there's nothing that we can do to stop it. On the other extreme, everything, that it can be completely stopped. We can completely unwind these processes. One other position is that necessary actions are already underway, that there needs to be regulation and these regulations are sufficient. So examples would be international non-government organizations. Sometimes they're just called NGOs, but the textbook calls them international NGOs. The UN is doing enough, that multinational corporations are already doing enough. And then other people think more, perhaps much more, needs to be done. For example, there needs to be a sufficient acknowledgement and work done to combat climate change and the sort of extreme inequality that we're seeing globally. So now we're on to the review questions. Explain how globalists and skeptics answer the question, is there such a thing as globalization? Naming at least two aspects of globalization upon which they disagree. So the globalists see as globalization as real, that global popular culture is significant still, it's not waning, that the nation state, whether powerful or weak, is a key part of globalization. Whereas skeptics say that globalization is an oversimplification of contradictory processes, that a significant portion of the world's population is significantly outside of these processes. They also emphasize the rise of nationalism as combating globalized phenomenon and acknowledge like the weakening of global popular culture. The next question, what are some major events that are identified when one attempts to answer the question of when globalization began? And what are three broader, more recent changes in the 20th century that seem to suggest we are living in a uniquely global era? So some major events would be the rise of the Roman Empire, the rise and spread of Christianity and Islam, the travels of the Vikings, the actions of banks in 12th century Italian city-states, which was sort of the beginning of finance and finance capital, the encountering the New World, European colonialism, certain technological advances. And those three more recent changes, as we mentioned, were the emergence of the U.S. as a superpower after World War II, the emergence of multinational corporations, and the demise of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. Explain the distinction between globalization from below, and globalization from above. What is one argument one would make about globalization from the perspective of globophilia, and what is one argument one would make from a globophobia perspective? So globalization from below involves marginalized groups and social movements that struggle to make globalization benefit more people. Globalization from above would be that globalization is a process created and controlled by sort of more centralized, powerful groups, such as a billionaire class, for example. From a globophilia perspective, you could argue that globalization seems to involve increasing democratization of the world, and that's a positive thing. Whereas from a globophobic perspective, you could say that increasing privatization has actually been detrimental to democracy. Then we also have discussion questions that you can consider responding to in your posts following this lecture. Is globalization an inexorable or unstoppable process? Should it be? Is the current era unique in terms of globalization? And what factors contribute to or detract from this uniqueness? And do you agree more with the globalist or skeptic perspective? So we will end there, and the next lecture will be about imperialism, westernization, Americanization, and other processes that we can look at.